In the spring of 2022, Western intelligence agencies gave Ukraine 72 hours. 72 hours before Kyiv would fall, before the government would collapse, before a nation of 44 million people would be absorbed by the largest land army in Europe. That assessment, made by some of the most sophisticated analytical minds on the planet, turned out to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in the history of modern warfare. Nearly 4 years later, the country that was supposed to cease to exist as a sovereign state has become something that nobody, not Moscow, not Brussels, and perhaps least of all Washington, could have predicted. Ukraine has become a military power, not a survivor, not a client state propped up by foreign aid, a genuine, battle-hardened, technologically dominant military force that is now ranked among the top 20 most powerful armed forces on Earth, sitting ahead of Germany in the Global Military Power Index. The question is no longer whether Ukraine can survive. The question is how the rest of the world recalibrates to a Ukraine that has quietly, ferociously remade itself into something extraordinary. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to what Ukraine actually inherited when the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, Ukraine found itself holding approximately 30% of the Soviet military-industrial complex, a staggering endowment that included tank factories, missile production lines, aerospace infrastructure, and one of the largest standing armies in Europe. Then, in one of history's most consequential security decisions, Kyiv surrendered its nuclear arsenal in exchange for guarantees that its sovereignty and territorial integrity would be respected. Those guarantees, codified in the Budapest Memorandum and signed by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, proved to be worthless paper. Russia seized Crimea in 2014. Then it ignited a proxy war in the Donbass. Then, on February 24, 2022, it launched a full-scale invasion with an army that its own generals believed would overwhelm Ukrainian resistance within days. What Russia encountered instead was a country that had spent 8 years quietly transforming itself. The Ukrainian military that stood in 2014 was a hollowed-out post-Soviet institution, underfunded, under-equipped, and riddled with corruption. The military that met Russian tanks in 2022 was something entirely different. Veterans of 8 years of low-intensity conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk formed the backbone of a force that had internalized hard lessons about Russian tactics, Russian command structures, and Russian vulnerabilities. Those combat veterans seated newly mobilized units with battlefield wisdom that no amount of conventional training could replicate. When the full-scale war began, Ukraine was not starting from zero. It was deploying the institutional memory of a decade of warfare. But what has happened since then is what truly defies expectation. Ukraine entered the full-scale war as a nation dependent on foreign weapons. It fought with stockpiles of Soviet-era equipment and whatever the West was willing to send at whatever speed Washington and European capitals were comfortable with, which was often maddeningly slow. Ukraine bled through artillery shells faster than allies could manufacture them. It lost aircraft it could not replace. It absorbed missile strikes it could not intercept. And yet, underneath the grinding attrition, something extraordinary was being built. Ukraine was industrializing its own warfare. The transformation of Ukraine's drone industry is perhaps the most astonishing military-industrial story of the 21st century. Before the war, Ukraine had roughly a dozen companies producing unmanned systems. By 2024, that number had exploded to several hundred manufacturers operating in a decentralized civilian-military fusion model that bypassed the slow procurement cycles strangling Western defense industries. By 2025, Ukraine was producing approximately 4 million drones per year, more than all NATO member states combined. That figure, confirmed through multiple independent assessments, prompted a senior defense analyst at a major Washington think tank to observe with barely concealed astonishment that American weapons procurement, with its years-long acquisition cycles and congressional budget battles, counted success in hundreds or thousands of units. Ukraine was manufacturing in the millions. These are not toys. Ukraine's drone ecosystem spans a carefully designed three-tier architecture. At the tactical level, first-person view drones, light, fast, lethal, serve as the new artillery of the front line. These FPV platforms, which began as 7-inch carbon fiber quadcopters in 2022, have evolved into 13-inch universal strike platforms capable of carrying warheads, ISR cameras, or signal relay equipment. Ukrainian engineers working in a tight feedback loop between frontline operators and production workshops push new firmware, new jamming-resistant communications, and new airframe configurations into combat in a matter of weeks. Western defense acquisition systems require years for comparable updates. On the front, captured Russian soldiers reported something remarkable. They had spent days in combat without ever seeing a Ukrainian soldier. What they saw were drones everywhere. The drone wall, a layered defensive zone of unmanned systems now stretching up to 40 kilometers from the line of contact, has turned Russian advances into killing fields. At the strategic level, Ukraine's long-range drone program has rewritten what a nation under siege is capable of projecting. Ukrainian drones have struck oil refineries, fuel depots, and command and control nodes deep inside Russian territory. In one of the most audacious operations of the entire conflict, a coordinated swarm attack used over 100 custom-built drones to strike multiple Russian strategic bomber bases simultaneously, forcing Moscow to disperse its long-range aviation assets across a far wider footprint. Ukrainian drones have hit infrastructure in Siberia. They have struck the shadow fleet of sanctioned oil tankers operating in the Mediterranean. They have probed the very edges of what was considered strategically permissible. Ukrainian commanders now estimate that drones account for well over half of Russian equipment losses on certain stretches of the front. A country that was supposed to have been dismembered in 72 hours is destroying Russian armor daily at a cost ratio that would make any defense economist blink. Then in late 2025, Ukraine made military history in a different domain entirely. A single unmanned ground vehicle, a land drone armed with a mounted machine gun, held a frontline position for 45 consecutive days in eastern Ukraine, conducting combat operations while being remotely maintained and reloaded every 48 hours. "Robots do not bleed," said the Ukrainian officer who oversaw the operation. That sentence encapsulates the entire strategic logic driving Ukraine's military transformation. Facing a manpower crisis that has seen mobilization, ages, and incentive structures repeatedly renegotiated, Ukraine has consciously moved toward a doctrine that preserves human life by deploying machines. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reported that it surpassed all unmanned ground vehicle supply targets in 2025, with further increases planned. Ukraine is not just fighting this war, it is inventing the next one. The financial dimensions of this transformation are equally striking. Ukraine's domestic defense industry, valued at roughly $1 billion before the war, has scaled toward a production capacity approaching $35 billion annually, driven overwhelmingly by drone and missile production. Private investment in Ukrainian defense technology surged by 900% in 2024 alone compared to the year prior. European governments and private capital, recognizing that Ukraine's battlefield ecosystem represents the most advanced real-world testing ground for 21st century warfare, are moving their money accordingly. In September 2025, Ukraine made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable 3 years earlier. It announced that controlled exports of surplus armaments would be permitted. A country fighting for its survival was becoming a defense exporter. Meanwhile, Ukraine's interceptor drone program has produced a cost asymmetry that has fundamentally altered the economics of air defense. 1 in every 3 Russian aerial targets destroyed over Ukraine is now brought down, not by a Patriot missile costing over $3 million, not by a NASAMS round costing over $1 million, but by an interceptor drone costing less than a used car. Over the capital, Kyiv, interceptor drones accounted for more than 70% of Shahed downings in a single month. Ukraine produced 100,000 interceptor drones in 2025 alone, with production capacity growing eightfold in the span of a year. Russia, meanwhile, has been launching Shahed drones at a rate exceeding 5,000 per month, a campaign designed to exhaust and overwhelm air defense stockpiles. Ukraine has answered by making the cost of that campaign economically unsustainable. This is the context in which Washington finds itself genuinely surprised. The Trump administration entered office in January 2025 with a clear priority: end the war in Ukraine quickly through negotiation. The assumption embedded in that posture was that Ukraine was the weaker party, dependent on American support and therefore susceptible to pressure. What followed was a jarring recalibration. Military aid was briefly suspended in the summer of 2025, a decision that reportedly surprised even elements of the White House and State Department and was swiftly reversed. A new assistance mechanism, the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, was constructed specifically to channel Allied funding through American defense industry channels, ensuring that support continued even without a formal congressional commitment. The United States, having stepped back from leading the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, watched as the United Kingdom and Germany stepped into that leadership role without missing a beat. The geopolitical architecture forming around Ukraine in early 2026 reflects a new reality. At a summit of 35 nations in Paris in January, France and the United Kingdom pledged to establish military hubs on Ukrainian soil in the event of a ceasefire, with protected facilities for weapons and equipment. The coalition of the willing committed to a U.S.-led ceasefire monitoring mechanism involving drones, sensors, and satellites. The conversation is no longer about whether Ukraine survives. It is about how to build deterrence architecture around a country that has demonstrated it can fight, and fight effectively, against one of the world's most heavily armed militaries. The Ukrainian armed forces, which numbered 209,000 active personnel before the war, now stand at approximately 880,000, ranked as the fifth largest military force in the world by total strength. Peace talks continue, threading through Geneva, Abu Dhabi, and the corridors of European capitals. But Ukraine is negotiating from a position that bears no resemblance to the position of a defeated nation. Zelensky has rejected demands to cede additional territory in the Donbass, calling such proposals functionally indefensible to a people who have buried 250,000 in combat. Kyiv has set a strategic benchmark of inflicting 50,000 Russian casualties per month, a figure reflecting not desperation but calculation. Russia, for its part, captured 1,265 square miles of Ukrainian territory across all of 2025, significant, but at no point amounting to more than 60 miles of penetration at any single location, and at no point seizing territory of operational significance. The fortress belt anchoring Ukrainian defenses in Donetsk has held. What the world is now confronting is the strategic consequence of a truth that took 4 years to fully register. Ukraine was not asking for permission to survive. It was building the tools to do so regardless. The drone factories running around the clock in dispersed locations across the country, the volunteer engineers pushing firmware updates to pilots 40 kilometers away, the unmanned ground vehicle holding a trench line for 6 weeks while human soldiers remained safely behind. These are not the artifacts of a dependent client state. They are the artifacts of a nation that has transformed existential pressure into industrial innovation at a speed that the most powerful military alliance in history has struggled to match. The lesson that every general staff in the world is now absorbing, from Paris to Tokyo to Washington, is uncomfortable in its simplicity. The country that was supposed to fall in 72 hours spent 4 years building the most battle-tested, drone-dominant, asymmetrically innovative military force on the European continent. Ukraine didn't wait to be saved, it built something. And what it built has changed the nature of modern warfare in ways that defense establishments will spend decades studying. The shock felt in Washington is not the shock of an ally that surprised its patron. It is the shock of recognition, the moment a superpower realizes that the student has, in certain essential domains, surpassed the teacher. Whatever form the eventual peace takes, Ukraine will emerge from this war not as a broken country begging for reconstruction, but as a military power that proved a point the entire world was forced to watch. That innovation, will, and the refusal to yield can remake the balance of power even against a nuclear-armed adversary with the world's fourth-largest defense budget. That is a lesson history will not forget easily.